I'll make it good. I promise. I promise.
Hey, Fire, how you doing?
All Ned could do was
Give me
take
1
his
second.
arm
I
and
gotta
hold her
finish
while she wept.
doing a
He
little
looked
grubbing.
across the room at Robert, his old friend, close up and getting on. Please, Robert, for the love you bury, for the love you bore my sister, please. The king looked at them for a long moment, then turned his eyes on his wife. Damn you, Cersei, he said with loathing. Ned stood, gently disengaging himself from Sansa's grasp. All the weariness of the past 4 days had returned to him. "Do it yourself, then, Robert," he said in a voice cold and sharp as steel. "At least
Hey,
take the courage to do it yourself."
And the barbecue ones I liked better than the other ones. I tried the hot sauce ones. I tried the regular ones. But out of all of them, I say the barbecue is the best.
Cersei Lannister asked when her husband was gone. Beside her, Prince Joffrey was smiling. "The beast is chained up outside the gatehouse, Your Grace," Sir Barristan Selmy answered reluctantly. "Send for Illian Payne." "No," Ned said. "Jory, take the girls back to their rooms and bring me ice." The words tasted of fire in his throat, but he forced them out. "If it must be done, I will do it." Cersei Lannister regarded him suspiciously. "You, Stark? Is this some trick? Why would you do such a thing?" They were all staring at him, but the senses of the country. "She is of the north. She deserves better than a butcher." He left the room with his eyes burning, and his daughter's wail.
Hell yeah, that don't sound too bad.
And found the dog walked up where they turned. Then he sat beside him. "Lady," he said, tasting the raven. He never paid much attention to the babes children did, but looking at her now, he knew that Sansa had chosen her. She was the smallest of the litter, the prettiest, the most gentle. She looked at him with bright golden eyes, and he ruffled her. Shortly, Jory brought him ice. When it was over, he said, "Choose 4 men and have them take the body north, bury her at Winterfell." "All that way?" Jory said, astonished. "All that way," Ned affirmed. "The Lannister woman shall never have this skin." He was walking back to the tower to give himself up to sleep. Then the stand up again, and his riders came pounding through the castle gates back from the hunt. There was something slung over the back of his destiny, a heavy shape wrapped in a bloody toga. "No sign of your daughter, and," the hound rasped down, "but the Dane was not wholly wasted. We got a little pet."
No, I had the wrong book on. Give me a sec.
Across a dozen paces behind him, Balor glanced up and noticed the mounting tension in the hook. But Burrow wouldn't realize that they could not afford any delays, so he shrugged and pushed Blacker off, motioning down the passage toward the green line. Blacker started away, and Drift and Balor fell into step behind. "That's the Balor whispered as they rounded a last bend in the tunnel. Drift shook his head closer, and Balor, remembering Guinevere's last painful episode in the Courtney chamber, did not question her further. Drift patted the Kitten on his shoulder for luck, then moved up past Blacker and was the first to enter the quiet chamber. With a few simple motions, the Drow stepped into a levitation spell and floated silently up. Blacker, in a strange place with a glowing lack of acid below him, hardly noticed the movements. The Hookar stood perfectly still, glancing all about the chamber and using his keen sense of hearing to locate any possible enemies. "Move," Hookar whispered behind him. "Do They will bring disaster. Then picked up speed and gained confidence in the strength of the narrow, unsupported walkway. He took the straightest course he could discern, though even this meandered about before it reached the exiting archway opposite the one he had entered. "Did you see anything, Dark Elf?" Belvoir called as loudly as he dared for uneventful moments later. Clacker had passed the midpoint of the chamber without incident, and the Burrow Warden could not contain his mounting anxiety. No corgis had shown themselves. Not a sound had been made beyond the heavy thumping of Clacker's feet and the shuffling of Belvoir's worn boots. Drizzt floated back down to the ledge, far behind his companions. "Nothing," he replied. The drow shared Belvoir's suspicions that no dire corgis were about. The hush of the acid-filled cavern was absolute and unnerving. Drizzt ran out toward the center of the chamber, then lifted off again in his levitation, trying to get a better angle on all of the walls. "What do you see?" Belvoir asked a moment later. Drizzt looked down to the Burrow Warden and shrugged. "Nothing at all." "Maga Camera," grumbled Belvoir, almost wishing that a corgi would step out and attack. Clacker had nearly reached the targeted exit by this time, though Belvoir, in his conversation with Drizzt, had lagged behind and remained near the center of the huge room. When the Burrow Warden finally turned back to the path ahead, the Hookar had disappeared under the arch of the exit. "Anything?" Belvoir called out to both of his companions. Drizzt shook his head and continued to rise. He rotated slowly about, scanning the walls, unable to believe that no corgis lurked in ambush. Belvoir looked back to the exit. "We must have chased them out," he muttered to himself. But in spite of his words, the Burrow Warden knew better. When he and Drizzt had taken flight from this room a couple of 10 days before, they had left several dozen of the birdmen behind them. Certainly the toll of a few dead corgis would not have chased away the rest of the fearless clan. For some unknown reason, no corgis had come out to stand against them. Belvoir started off at a quick pace, thinking it best not to question their good fortune. He was about to call out to Clacker to confirm that the Hookar had indeed moved to safety, when a sharp, terror-filled squeal rolled out from the exit, followed by a heavy crash. A moment later, Belvoir and Drizzt had their answers. The spirit wraith of Zaknafein de Werden stepped under the arch and out onto the ledge. "Dark Elf!" the Burrow Warden called sharply. Drizzt had already seen the spirit wraith and was descending as rapidly as he could toward the walkway near the middle of the chamber. "Clacker!" Belvoir called, but he expected no answer and received none from the shadows beyond the doorway. The spirit wraith steadily advanced. "You murderous beast!" the Burrow Warden cursed, setting his feet wide apart and slamming his mithril hands together. "Come out and get your due!" Belvoir fell into his chant to empower his hands, but Drizzt interrupted him. "No," the drow cried out high above. "Zaknafein is here for me, not you. Move out of his way." "Was he here for Clacker?" Belvoir yelled back. "A murderous beast he is, and I have a score to settle." "You do not know that," Drizzt replied, increasing his descent as fast as he dared to catch up to the fearless Burrow Warden. Drizzt knew that Zaknafein would get to Belvoir first, and he could guess easily enough the grim consequences. "Trust me now, I beg," Drizzt pleaded. "This drow warrior is far beyond your abilities." Belvoir banged his hands together again, but he could not honestly refute Drizzt's words. Belvoir had seen Zaknafein in battle only that one time in the Illithid cavern, but the monster's blurring movements had stolen his breath. The deep gnome backed away a few steps and turned down a side walkway, seeking another route to the arched exit so that he might learn Clacker's fate. With Drizzt so plainly in sight, the spirit wraith paid the little Zwerfneblin no heed. Zaknafein charged right past the side walkway and continued on to fulfill the purpose of his existence. Belvoir thought to pursue the strange drow, to close from behind and help Drizzt in the battle, but another cry issued from under the archway, a cry so pain-filled and pitiful that the Burrow Warden could not ignore it. He stopped as soon as he got back on the main walkway, then looked both ways, torn in his loyalties. "Go!" Drizzt shouted at him. "See to Clacker! This is Zaknafein, my father!" Drizzt noticed a slight hesitation in the spirit wraith's charge at the mention of those words, a hesitation that brought Drizzt a flicker of understanding.
Your father? Maga Camera, Dark Elf, Belwar protested. Back in the Illithid Cavern.
I am safe enough, Drizzt interjected. Belwar did not believe that Drizzt was safe at all, but against the protest of his own stubborn pride, the Burrow Warden realized that the battle that was about to begin was far beyond his abilities. He would be of little help against this mighty Drow warrior, and his presence in the battle might actually prove detrimental to his friend. Drizzt would have a difficult enough time without worrying about Belwar's safety. Belwar banged his mithril hands together in frustration and rushed toward the archway and the continuing moans of his fallen hook horror companion. Matron Malice's eyes widened, and she uttered a sound so primal that her daughters, gathered by her side in the anteroom, knew immediately that the spirit wraith had found Drizzt. Briza glanced over at the younger Do'Urden priestesses and dismissed them. Maya obeyed immediately, but Fierna hesitated. Go, Briza snarled, one hand dropping to the snake-headed whip on her belt. Now! Fierna looked to her matron mother for support, but Malice was quite lost in the spectacle of the distant events. This was the moment of triumph for Zincarla and for Matron Malice Do'Urden. She would not be distracted by the petty squabbling of her inferiors. Briza then was alone with her mother, standing behind the throne and studying Malice as intently as Malice watched Zaknafein. As soon as he entered the small chamber beyond the archway, Belwar knew that Clacker was dead, or soon would be. The giant hook horror body lay on the floor, bleeding from a single but wickedly precise wound across the neck.
Hell yeah.
Belwar began to turn away, then realized that he owed comfort at least to his fallen friend. He dropped to one knee and forced himself to watch as Clacker went into a series of violent convulsions. Death terminated the polymorph spell, and Clacker gradually reverted to his former self. The huge clawed arms trembled and jerked, twisted and popped into the long and spindly, yellow-skinned arms of a Petch. Hair sprouted through the cracking armor of Clacker's head, and the great beak split apart and dissipated. The massive chest, too, fell away, and the whole body compacted with a grinding sound that sent shivers up and down the hardy Burrow Warden's spine. The hook horror was no more, and in death, Clacker was as he had been. He was a bit taller than Belwar, though not nearly as wide, and his features were broad and strange, with pupilless eyes and a flattened nose.
What was your name, my friend?
Whispered, though he knew that Clacker would never answer. He bent down and lifted the Petch's head in his arms, taking some comfort in the peace that had finally come to the tormented creature's face. Who are you that takes the guise of my father? Drizzt asked as the spirit wraith stalked across the last few paces. Zaknafein's snarl was indecipherable, and his response came more clearly in a hacking slice of a sword. Drizzt parried the attack and jumped back. Who are you? He demanded. You are not my father. A wide smile spread over the spirit wraith's face. No, Zaknafein replied in a shaky voice, an answer that was inspired from an anteroom many miles away. I am your mother. The swords came on again in a blinding flurry. Drizzt, confused by the response, met the charge with equal ferocity, and the many sudden hits of sword on scimitar sounded like a single ring. Briza watched her mother's every movement. Sweat poured down Malice's brow, and her clenched fists pounded on the arms of her stone throne, even after they had begun to bleed. Malice had hoped that it would be like this, that the final moment of her triumph would shine clearly in her thoughts from across the miles. She heard Drizzt's every frantic word and felt his distress so very keenly. Never had Malice known such pleasure. Then she felt a slight twinge as Zaknafein's consciousness struggled against her control. Malice pushed Zaknafein aside with a guttural snarl. His animated corpse was her tool. Briza noted her mother's sudden snarl with more than a passing interest. Drizzt knew beyond any doubts that this was not Zaknafein Do'Urden who stood before him, yet he could not deny the unique fighting style of his former mentor. Zaknafein was in there, somewhere, and Drizzt would have to reach him if he hoped to get any answers. The battle quickly settled into a comfortable, measured rhythm, both opponents launching cautious attack routines and paying careful attention to their tenuous footing on the narrow walkway. Belwar entered the room then, bearing Clacker's broken body.
Kill him, Drizzt,
the Burrow Warden cried.
Maga.
Belwar stopped and was afraid when he witnessed the battle. Drizzt and Zaknafein seemed to intertwine, their weapons spinning and darting, only to be parried away. They seemed as one, these two dark elves that Belwar had considered distinctly different, and that notion unnerved the Deep Gnome. When the next break came in the struggle, Drizzt glanced over to the Burrow Warden, and his gaze locked on the dead Petch. Damn you, he spat, and he rushed back in, scimitars diving and chopping at the monster who had murdered Clacker. The Spirit Wraith parried the foolishly bold assault easily, and worked Drizzt blades up high, rocking Drizzt back on his heels. This too seemed so very familiar to the young drow, a fighting approach that Zaknafein had used against him many times in their sparring matches back in Menzoberranzan. Zaknafein would force Drizzt high, then come in suddenly low with both of his swords. In their early contests, Zaknafein had often defeated Drizzt with this maneuver, the double thrust low. But in their last encounter in the Drow city, Drizzt had found the answering parry and had turned the attack against his mentor. Now Drizzt wondered if this opponent would follow through with the expected attack routine, and he wondered too how Zaknafein would react to his counter. Were any of Zak's memories within the monster he now faced? Still, the Spirit Wraith kept Drizzt's blades working defensively high. Zaknafein then took a quick step back and came in low with both blades. Drizzt dropped his scimitars into a downward X, the appropriate cross-down parry that pinned the attacking swords low. Drizzt kicked his foot up between the hilts of his blades and straight at his opponent's face. The Spirit Wraith somehow anticipated the countering attack and was out of reach before the boot could connect. Drizzt believed that he had an answer, for only Zaknafein Do'Urden could have known.
You are Zaknafein, Drizzt cried. What has Malice done to you?
The Spirit Wraith's hands trembled visibly in their hold on the swords, and his mouth twisted as though he was trying to say something. No, Malice screamed, and she violently tore back the control of her monster, walking the delicate and dangerous line between Zaknafein's physical abilities and the consciousness of the being he once had been. You are mine, Wraith, Malice bellowed, and by the will of Lolth you shall complete the task. Drizzt saw the sudden regression of the murderous Spirit Wraith. Zaknafein's hands no longer trembled, and his mouth locked into a thin and determined grimace once again.
What is it, Dark Elf?
Belwar demanded, confused by the strange encounter. Drizzt noticed that the Deep Gnome had placed Clacker's body on a ledge and was steadily approaching. Sparks flew from Belwar's mithril hands whenever they bumped together. Stay back, Drizzt called to him. The presence of an unknown enemy could ruin the plans that were beginning to formulate in Drizzt's mind. It is Zaknafein, he tried to explain to Belwar, or at least a part of it is. In a voice too low for the Burrow Warden to hear, Drizzt added, and I believe I know how to get to that part. Drizzt came on in a flurry of measured attacks that he knew Zaknafein could easily deflect. He did not want to destroy his opponent, but rather he sought to inspire other memories of fighting routines that would be familiar to Zaknafein. He put Zaknafein through the paces of a typical training session, talking all the while in the same way that he and the Weapon Master used to talk back in Menzoberranzan. Malice's Spirit Wraith countered Drizzt's familiarity with savagery and matched Drizzt's friendly words with animal-like snarls. If Drizzt thought he could lull his opponent with complacency, he was badly mistaken. Swords rushed at Drizzt inside and out, seeking a hole in his expert defenses. Scimitars matched their speed and precision, catching and stopping each arcing cut and deflecting every straightforward thrust harmlessly wide. A sword slipped through and nicked Drizzt in the ribs. His fine armor held back the weapon's razor edge, but the weight of the blow would leave a deep bruise. Brought back on his heels, Drizzt saw that his plan would not be so easily executed. You are my father, he shouted at the monster. Matron Malice is your enemy, not I. The Spirit Wraith mocked the words with an evil laugh and came on wildly. From the very beginning of the battle, Drizzt had feared this moment, but now he stubbornly reminded himself that this was not really his father that stood before him. Zaknafein's careless offensive charge inevitably left gaps in his defenses, and Drizzt found them once and then again with his scimitars. One blade dashed a hole in the spirit wraith's belly, another slashed deeply into the side of his neck. Zaknafein only laughed again, louder, and came on. Drizzt fought in sheer panic, his confidence faltering. Zaknafein was nearly his equal, and Drizzt's blades barely hurt the thing.
1 second.
Another problem quickly became evident as well, for time was against Drizzt. He did not know exactly what it was that he faced, but he suspected that it would not tire. Drizzt pressed with all his skill and speed. Desperation drove him to new heights of swordsmanship. Belwar started out again to join him, but he stopped a moment later, stunned by the display. Drizzt hit Zaknafein several more times, but the spirit wraith seemed not to notice, and as Drizzt stepped up the tempo, the spirit wraith's intensity grew to match his own. Drizzt could hardly believe that this was not Zaknafein Do'Urden fighting against him. He could recognize the moves of his father and former mentor so very clearly. No other soul could move that perfectly muscled drow body with such precision and skill. Drizzt was backing away again, giving ground and waiting patiently for his opportunities. He reminded himself over and over that it was not Zaknafein that he faced, but some monster created by Matron Malice for the sole purpose of destroying him. Drizzt had to be ready. His only chance of surviving this encounter was to trip his opponent from the ledge. With the spirit wraith fighting so brilliantly, though, that chance seemed remote indeed. The walkway turned slightly around a short bend, and Drizzt felt it carefully with one foot, sliding it along. Then a rock right under Drizzt's foot broke free from the side of the walkway. Drizzt stumbled, and his leg to the knee slipped down beside the bridge. Zaknafein came upon him in a rush. The whirling sword soon had Drizzt down on his back across the narrow walkway, his head hanging precariously over the lake of acid.
Drizzt!
Belwar screamed helplessly. The deep gnome rushed out, though he could not hope to arrive in time or defeat Drizzt's killer.
Drizzt!
Perhaps it was that call of Drizzt's name, or maybe it was just the moment of the kill. But the former consciousness of Zaknafein flickered to life in that instant, and the sword arm, readied for a killing plunge that Drizzt could not have reflected, hesitated. Drizzt didn't wait for any explanations. He punched out with a scimitar hilt, then the other, both connecting squarely on Zaknafein's jaw and moving the spirit wraith back. Drizzt was up again, panting and favoring a twisted ankle.
Zaknafein!
Confused and frustrated by the hesitation, Drizzt screamed at his opponent.
Drizzt!
The spirit wraith's mouth struggled to reply. Then Malice's monster rushed back in, sword leading. Drizzt defeated the attack and slipped away again. He could sense his father's presence. He knew that the true Zaknafein lurked just below the surface of this creature, but how could he free that spirit? Clearly, he could not hope to continue this struggle much longer.
It is you,
Drizzt whispered.
No one else could fight so. Zaknafein is there, and Zaknafein will not kill me.
Another thought came to Drizzt then, a notion he had to believe. Once again, the truth of Drizzt's convictions became the test. Drizzt slipped his scimitars back into their sheaths. The spirit wraith snarled. His swords danced about in the air and cut viciously. But Zaknafein did not come on.
Nice little ring around it.
Kill him! Malice squealed in glee, thinking her moment of victory at hand. The images of the combat, though, flitted away from her suddenly, and she was left with only darkness. She had given too much back to Zaknafein, where Drizzt had stepped up the tempo of the combat. She had been forced to allow more of Zak's consciousness back into her animation, needing all of Zaknafein's fighting skills to defeat her warrior son. Now Malice was left with blackness, and with the weight of impending doom hanging precariously over her head. She glanced back at her too curious daughter, then sank back within her trance, fighting to regain control.
Drizzt,
Zaknafein said, and the word felt so very good indeed to the animation. Zak's swords went into their sheaths, though his hands had to struggle against the demands of Matron Malice every inch of the way. Drizzt started toward him, wanting nothing more than to hug his father and dearest friend, but Zaknafein put out a hand to keep him back. No, the spirit explained. I do not know how long I can resist.
The body is hers, I fear, Zaknafein replied. Drizzt did not understand at first. Then you are. I am dead, Zaknafein stated bluntly. At peace, be assured. Malice has repaired my body for her own vile purposes. But you defeated her, Drizzt said, daring to hope. We are together again. A temporary stay, and no more. As if to accentuate the point, Zaknafein's hand involuntarily shot to his sword hilt. He screamed and snarled and stubbornly fought back, gradually loosening his grip on the weapon. He's coming back, my son. One is always coming back. I cannot bear to lose you again, Drizzt said. When I saw you in the Illithid cavern, it was not me that you saw, Zaknafein tried to explain. It was the zombie of Malice's evil will. I am gone, my son. I have been gone for many years. You are here, Drizzt reasoned. By Malice's will, not my own, Zaknafein growled, and his face contorted as he struggled to push Malice away for just a moment longer. Back in control, Zaknafein studied the warrior that his son had become. You fight well, he remarked. Better than I had ever imagined. That is good. And it is good that you had the courage to run. Zaknafein's face contorted again suddenly, stealing the words. This time, both of his hands went to his swords, and this time, both weapons came flashing out. No, Drizzt pleaded, as a mist welled in his lavender eyes. Fight her! I cannot, the spirit wraith replied. Flee from this place, Drizzt. Flee to the very ends of the world. Malice will never forgive. She will never stop. The spirit wraith leaped forward, and Drizzt had no choice but to draw his weapons. But Zaknafein jerked suddenly before he got within reach of Drizzt. For us, Zak cried in startling clarity, a call that pealed like a trumpet of victory in the green glowing chamber and echoed across the miles to Matron Malice's heart like the final toll of a drum signaling the onset of doom. Zaknafein had wrested control again for just a fleeting instant, one that allowed the charging spirit wraith to veer off the walkway. 25. Consequences. Matron Malice could not even scream her denial. 1,000 explosions pounded her brain when Zaknafein went into the acid lake, 1,000 realizations of impending and unavoidable disaster. She leaped from her stone throne, her slender hands twisting and clenching in the air, as though she were trying to find something tangible to grasp, something that wasn't there. Her breath rasped in labored gasps, and wordless snarls issued from her gulping mouth. After a moment in which she could not calm herself, Malice heard one sound more clearly than the din of her own contortions. Behind her came the slight hiss of the small, wicked snakeheads of a high priestess's whip. Malice spun about, and there stood Briza, her face grimly and determinedly set, and her whip's 6 living snakeheads waving in the air. I had hoped that my time of ascension would be many years away, the eldest daughter said calmly. But you are weak, Malice. Too weak to hold House Do'Urden together in the trials that will follow your failure. Malice wanted to laugh in the face of her daughter's foolishness. Snake-headed whips were personal gifts from the Spider Queen and could not be used against matron mothers. For some reason, though, Malice could not find the courage or conviction to refute her daughter at that moment. She watched, mesmerized, as Briza's arms slowly reared back and then shot forward. The 6 snakeheads uncoiled toward Malice. It was impossible. It went against all the tenets of Lolth's doctrine. The fanged heads came on eagerly and dived into Malice's flesh with all the Spider Queen's fury behind them. Searing agony coursed through Malice's body, jolting and racking her and leaving an icy numbness in its wake. Malice teetered on the brink of consciousness, trying to hold firmly against her daughter, trying to show Briza the futility and stupidity of continuing the attack. The snake whip snapped again, and the floor rushed up to swallow Malice. Breeza muttered something Malice heard, some curse or chant to the Spider Queen. Then came a third crack, and Malice knew nothing more. She was dead before the fifth strike, but Breeza pounded on for many minutes, venting her fury to let the Spider Queen be assured that House Do'Urden truly had forsaken its failing matron mother. By the time Dinan, unexpectedly and unannounced, burst into the room, Breeza had settled comfortably into the stone throne. The elder boy glanced over at his mother's battered body, then back to Breeza, his head shaking in disbelief, and a wide, knowing grin splayed across his face. "What have you done, sis?" "Matron Breeza," Dinan asked, catching his slip of the tongue before Breeza could react to it. "Zincarla has failed," Breeza growled as she glared at him. "Lolth would no longer accept Malice." Dinan's laughter, which seemed founded in sarcasm, cut to the marrow of Breeza's bones. Her eyes narrowed further, and she let Dinan see her hand clearly as it moved down to the hilt of her whip. "You have chosen the perfect moment for ascension," the elder boy explained calmly, apparently not at all worried that Breeza would punish him. "We are under attack." "Fey Branch?" Breeza cried, springing excitedly from her seat. 5 minutes in the throne as matron mother, and already Breeza faced her first test. She would prove herself to the Spider Queen and redeem House Do'Urden from much of the damage that Malice's failures had caused. "No, sister," Dinan said quickly, without pretense. "Not House Fey Branch." Her brother's cool response put Breeza back in the throne and twisted her grin of excitement into a grimace of pure dread. "They Henry." Dinan, too, no longer smiled. Vierna and Maya looked out from House Do'Urden's balcony to the approaching forces beyond the adamantite gate. The sisters did not know their enemy, as Dinan had, but they understood from the sheer size of the force that some great house was involved. Still, House Do'Urden boasted 250 soldiers, many trained by Zaknafein himself, with 200 more well-trained and well-armed troops on loan from Matron Bayenri. Both Vierna and Maya figured that their chances were not so bad. They
Diablo
quickly
3
outlined defense strategies,
Reaper Assault
and Maya
right
swung
now.
one leg over the balcony railing, meaning to descend to the courtyard and relay the plans to her captains. Of course, when she and Vierna suddenly realized that they had 200 enemies already within their gates, enemies they had accepted on loan from Matron Bayenri, their plans meant little. Maya still straddled the railing when the first Bayenri soldiers came up on the balcony. Vierna drew her whip and cried for Maya to do the same. But Maya was not moving, and Vierna, on closer inspection, noticed several tiny darts protruding from her sister's body. Vierna's own snake-headed whip turned on her then, its fangs slicing across her delicate face. Vierna understood at once that House Do'Urden's downfall had been decreed by Lolth herself. "Zincarla," Vierna mumbled, realizing the source of the disaster. Blood blurred her vision, and a wave of dizziness overtook her as darkness closed in all about her. "This cannot be," Breeza cried. "House Bayenri attacks? Lolth has not given me—" "We had our chance," Dinan yelled at her. "Zaknafein was our chance." Dinan looked to his mother's torn body. "And the Wraith has failed, I would assume." Breeza growled and lashed out with her whip. Dinan expected the strike, though. He knew Breeza so very well, and he darted beyond the weapon's range. Breeza took a step toward him. "Does your anger require more enemies?" Dinan asked, swords in hand. "Go out to the balcony, dear sister, where you will find 1,000 awaiting you." Breeza cried out in frustration, but turned away from Dinan and rushed from the room, hoping to salvage something out of this terrible predicament. Dinan did not follow. He stooped over Matron Malice and looked one final time into the eyes of the tyrant who had ruled his entire life. Malice had been a powerful figure, confident and wicked, but how fragile her rule had proved, broken by the antics of a renegade child. Dinan heard a commotion out in the corridor. Then the anteroom door swung open again. The elder boy did not have to look to know that enemies were in the room. He continued to stare at his dead mother, knowing that he soon would share the same fate. The expected blow did not fall, however. and several agonizing moments later, Dinan dared to glance back over his shoulder. Jarlaxle sat comfortably on the stone throne. "You are not surprised?" the mercenary asked, noting that Dinan's expression did not change. "Breaking the Earth was among the Baenri troops, perhaps all of the Baenri troops," Dinan said casually. He covertly glanced around the room at the dozen or so soldiers who had followed Jarlaxle in. If only he could get to the mercenary leader before they killed him, Dinan thought. Watching the death of the treacherous Jarlaxle might bring some measure of satisfaction to this whole disaster. "Observant," Jarlaxle said to him. "I hold to my suspicions that you knew all along that your house was doomed." "If Sincarla failed," Dinan replied. "And you knew it would?" the mercenary asked, almost rhetorically. Dinan nodded. 10 years ago, he began, wondering why he was telling all this to Jarlaxle. "I watched as Zaknafein was sacrificed to the Spider Queen. Rarely has any house in all of Menzo Baranzon seen a greater waste. The weapon master of House Baranzon has a mighty reputation," the mercenary put in. "Well earned, do not doubt," replied Dinan. "And Drizzt, my brother, another mighty warrior." Again Dinan nodded. "Drizzt deserted us. With war at our gates, Matron Malice's miscalculation could not be ignored. I knew then that House Do'Urden was doomed." "Your house defeated House Hannet, no small feat," reasoned Jarlaxle. "Only with the help of Breaking the Earth," Dinan corrected. "For most of my life, I have watched House Do'Urden, under Matron Malice's steady guidance, ascend through the city hierarchy. Every year our power and influence grew. For the last decade, though, I have seen us spiral down. I have watched the foundations of House Do'Urden crumble. The structure had to follow the descent." "As wise as you are skilled with the blade," the mercenary remarked. "I have said that before of Dinan Do'Urden, and it seems that I am proved correct once again." "If I have pleased you, I ask one favor," Dinan said, rising to his feet. "Grant it if you will." "Kill you quickly and without pain?" Jarlaxle asked, through a widening smile. Dinan nodded for the third time. "No," Jarlaxle said simply. Not understanding, Dinan brought his sword flashing up and ready. "I'll not kill you at all," Jarlaxle explained. Dinan kept his sword up high and studied the mercenary's face, looking for some hint as to his intent. "I am a noble of the house," Dinan said. "A witness to the attack. No house elimination is complete if nobles remain alive." "A witness?"
The one I like using
"Against
least
House
now,
Baenri? To what
since
game?"
it's been a while.
Dinan's sword dropped.
When they did an update on it, they made
"And what is my fate?" Will Matron Baenri take me in?
when they did the whole Reaper
Dinan's
Souls, they
tone showed
introduced
he was not excited about that possibility.
a necromancer, and
Matron Baenri has little use.
if you know how to use them,
If any of your sisters survive,
it could be a
and I
little
believe the one
OP.
named Vierna has, they may find themselves in Matron Baenri's chapel. But the wicked old mother of
I
House
either use
Baenri
him
would never
or
see
a
the value of a
demon
male such
hunter.
as Dinan, I fear. "And what?" Dinan demanded. "I know your value," Jarlaxle stated casually. He led Dinan's gaze around to the concurring grins of his troops. "Breaking the Earth?" Dinan balked. "Me, a noble, to become a rogue?" Quicker than Dinan's eye could follow, Jarlaxle whipped the dagger into the body at his feet. The blade buried itself up to the hilt in Malice's back. "A rogue, or a corpse," Jarlaxle casually explained. It was not so difficult a choice. A few days later,
This one
Jarlaxle
I'm
and
putting
Dinan looked
some
back
around
on the
it
ruined
from
adamantite
that
gate
this
of House
weekend.
Do'Urden. Once it had stood so proud and strong, with its intricate carvings of spiders and the two formidable stalagmite pillars that served as guard towers. "How fast it changed," Dinan remarked. "I see all my former life before me, yet it is all gone." "Forget what has gone before," Jarlaxle suggested. The mercenary's sly wink told Dinan that he had something specific in mind as he completed the thought. "Except that which may aid in your future." Dinan did a quick visual inspection of himself and the ruins. My battle gear? He asked, fishing for Jarlaxle's intent. My training? Your brother, Drizzt. Again, the cursed name reared up to bring anguish to Dinan. It would seem that there is still the matter of Drizzt Do'Urden to be reconciled, Jarlaxle explained. He's a high prize in the eyes of the Spider Queen. Drizzt? Dinan asked again, hardly believing Jarlaxle's words. Why are you so surprised? Jarlaxle asked. Your brother is still alive, else why was Matron Malice brought down? What house could be interested in him? Dinan asked bluntly. Another mission for Matron Banry? Jarlaxle's laugh belittled him. Breaking the Earth may act without the guidance or the purse of a recognized house, he replied. You plan to go after my brother? It may be the perfect opportunity for Dinan to show his value to my little family, said Jarlaxle to no one in particular. Who better to catch the renegade that brought down House Do'Urden? Your brother's value increased many times over with the failure of Zincarla. I have seen what Drizzt has become, said Dinan. The cost will be great. My resources are limitless, Jarlaxle answered smugly. And no cost is too high if the gain is higher. The eccentric mercenary went silent for a short while, allowing Dinan's gaze to linger over the ruins of his once proud house. No, Dinan said suddenly. Jarlaxle turned a wary eye on him. I'll not go after Drizzt, Dinan explained. You serve Jarlaxle, the master of breaking the earth, the mercenary calmly reminded him. As I once served Malice, the matron of House Do'Urden, Dinan replied with equal calm. I would not venture out again after Drizzt for my mother. He looked at Jarlaxle squarely, unafraid of the consequences. And I shall not do it again for you. Jarlaxle spent a long moment studying his companion. Normally, the mercenary there would not tolerate such brazen insubordination, but Dinan was sincere and adamant, beyond doubt. Jarlaxle had accepted Dinan into Bragendy Earth because he valued the Elder Boar's experience and skill. He could not now readily dismiss Dinan's judgment. I could have you put to a slow death, Jarlaxle replied, more to see Dinan's reaction than to make any promises. He had no intention of destroying one as valuable as Dinan. No worse than the death and disgrace I would find at Drizzt's hands, Dinan answered calmly. Another long moment passed as Jarlaxle considered the implication of Dinan's words. Perhaps Bragendy Earth should rethink its plans for hunting the renegade. Perhaps the price would prove too high. Come, my soldier, Jarlaxle said at length. Let us return to our home, to the streets, where we might learn what adventures our futures hold. 26. Lights in the ceiling. Belwar ran along the walkways to get to his friend. Drizzt did not watch the Zwerfneblins approach. He kneeled on the narrow bridge, looking down to the bubbling spot in the green lake where Zaknafein had fallen. The acid sputtered and rolled. The scorched hilt of a sword came up into view, then disappeared under the opaque veil of green. He was there all along, Drizzt whispered to Belwar. My father. A mighty chance you took, Dark Elf, the Burrow Warden replied. Maga Tamara. When you put your blades away, I thought he would surely strike you down. He was there all along, Drizzt said again. He looked up at his Zwerfneblin friend. You showed me that. Belwar screwed up his face in confusion. The spirit cannot be separated from the body, Drizzt tried to explain. Not in life. He looked back to the ripples in the acid lake. And not in undeath. In my years alone in the wilds, I had lost myself, so I believed. You showed me the truth. The heart of Drizzt was never gone from his body. And so I knew it to be true as Acnafane.
Other forces were involved this time, remarked Belwar. I would not have been so certain.
You did not know Acnafane, Drizzt retorted. He rose to his feet, the moisture rimming his lavender eyes diminished by the sincere smile that widened across his face. I did. Spirit, not muscles, guides a warrior's blade. And only he who was truly Acnafane could move with such grace. A moment of crisis gave Acnafane the strength to resist my mother's will.
And you gave him the moment of crisis, reasoned Belwar. Defeat Matron Malice or kill his own son.
Belwar shook his bald head and crinkled up his nose.
Maga Camera, but you are brave, Dark Elf.
He shot Drizzt a wink.
Or stupid.
Neither, replied Drizzt. I only trusted in Acnafane. He looked back to the acid lake and said no more. Belwar fell silent and waited patiently while Drizzt finished his private eulogy. When Drizzt finally looked away from the lake, Belwar motioned for the drow to follow and started off along the walkway.
Come, the Burrow Warden said over his shoulder. Witness the truth of our slain friend.
Drizzt thought the Petch a beautiful thing, a beauty inspired by the peaceful smile that at last had found its way onto his tormented friend's face. He and Belwar said a few words, mumbled a few hopes to whatever gods might be listening, and gave Clacker to the acid lake, thinking it a preferable fate to the bellies of the carrion eaters that roamed the underdark corridors. Drizzt and Belwar set off again alone, as they had been when they first departed the Zvirfneblin city, and arrived in Blingdenstone a few days later. The guards at the city's mammoth gates, though obviously thrilled, seemed confused at their return. They allowed the two companions entrance on the Burrow Warden's promise that he would go straight off and inform King Schnicktig.
This time he will let you stay, Dark Elf,
Belwar said to Drizzt.
You beat the monster.
He left Drizzt at his house, vowing that he would return soon with welcome news. Drizzt wasn't so sure of any of it. Acnafane's final warning that Matron Malice would never give up her hunt remained clearly in his thoughts, and he could not deny the truth. Much had happened in the 10 days that he and Belwar had been out of Blingdenstone, but none of it, as far as Drizzt knew, diminished the very real threat to the Zvirfneblin city. Drizzt had only agreed to follow Belwar back to Blingdenstone because it seemed a proper first step to the plan he had decided on. How long shall we battle Matron Malice? Drizzt asked the blank stone when the Burrow Warden had gone. He needed to hear his reasoning spoken aloud, to convince himself beyond doubt that his decision had been a wise one. Neither gains in the conflict, but that is the way of the drow, is it not? Drizzt fell back onto one of the stools beside the little table and considered the truth of his words. You will hunt me, to your ruin or to mine, blinded by the hatred that rules your life. There can be no forgiveness in Menzo Berenzon. That would go against the edict of your foul Spider Queen. And this is the Underdark, your world of shadows and gloom. But it is not all the world, Matron Malice, and I shall see how long your evil arms can reach. Drizzt sat silent for many minutes, remembering his first lessons at the Drow Academy. He tried to find some clue that would lead him to believe that the stories of the surface world were no more than lies. The Master's deceptions at the Drow Academy had been perfected over centuries and were infallibly complete. Drizzt soon came to realize that he simply would have to trust his feelings. When Belwar returned, grim-faced, a few hours later, Drizzt's resolve was firm.
Stubborn orc-brained,
the Burrow Warden gnashed through his teeth as he crossed through the stone door. Drizzt stopped him with a heartfelt laugh.
They will not hear of your staying,
Belwar yelled at him, trying to steal his mirth. Did you truly expect otherwise? Drizzt asked him. My fight is not over, dear Belwar. Do you believe that my family could be so easily defeated? We will go back out, Belwar growled, moving over to take the stool near Drizzt. My generous, the word dripped of sarcasm. King, agreed that you could remain in the city for a 10-day, a single 10-day. When I leave alone, Drizzt interrupted. He pulled the onyx figurine out of his pouch and reconsidered his words. Almost alone. We had this argument before, Dark Elf, Belwar reminded him. That was different. Was it? Retorted the Burrow Warden. Will you survive any better alone in the wilds of the Underdark now than you did before? Have you forgotten the burdens of loneliness? I'll not be in the Underdark, Drizzt replied. Back to your homeland you mean to go? Belwar cried, leaping to his feet and sending his stool skidding across the stone. No, never, Drizzt laughed. Never will I return to Menzoberranzan, unless it is at the end of Matron Malice's chains. The Burrow Warden retrieved his seat and eased back into it, curious. Neither will I remain in the Underdark, Drizzt explained. This is Malice's world, more fitting to the dark heart of a true drow. Belwar began to understand, but he couldn't believe what he was hearing. What are you saying? He demanded. Where do you mean to go? The surface, Drizzt replied evenly. Belwar leaped up again, sending his stone stool bouncing even farther across the floor. I was up there once, Drizzt continued, undaunted by the reaction. He calmed the Zwerfneplin with a determined gaze. I partook of a drow massacre. Only the actions of my companions bring pain to my memories of that journey. The sense of the wide world and the cool feel of the wind bring no dread to my heart. The surface, Belwar muttered, his head lowered and his voice almost a groan. Maga Camera. Never did I plan to travel there. It is not the place of a Zwerfneplin. Belwar pounded the table suddenly and looked up, a determined smile on his face. But if Drizzt will go, then Belwar will go by his side. Drizzt will go alone, the drow replied. As you just said, the surface is not the place of a Zwerfneplin. Nor a drow, the deep gnome added pointedly. I do not fit the usual expectations of drow, Drizzt retorted. My heart is not their heart, and their home is not mine. How far must I walk through the endless tunnels to be free of my family's hatred? And if, in fleeing Menzoberranzan, I chance upon another of the great dark elf cities, Jed Nassad or some similar place, will those drow too take up the hunt to fulfill the Spider Queen's desires that I be slain? No, Belwar. I will find no peace in the close ceilings of this world. You, I fear, would never be content removed from the stone of the Underdark. Your place is here, a place of deserved honor among your people. Belwar sat quietly for a long time, digesting all that Drizzt had said. He would follow Drizzt willingly, if Drizzt desired it so. But he truly did not wish to leave the Underdark. Belwar could raise no argument against Drizzt's desires to go. The Dark Elf would find many trials up on the surface, Belwar knew. But would they outweigh the pains Drizzt would ever experience in the Underdark? Belwar reached into a deep pocket and took out the light-giving brooch. Take this, Dark Elf, he said softly, flipping it to Drizzt. And do not forget me. Never for a single day in all the centuries of my future, Drizzt promised. Never once. The 10-day passed all too quickly for Belwar, who was reluctant to see his friend go. The Burrow Warden knew that he would never look upon Drizzt again, but he knew also that Drizzt's decision was a son. As a friend, Belwar took it upon himself to see that Drizzt had the best chance of success. He took the drow to the finest provisioners in all of Blingdenstone and paid for the supplies out of his own pocket. Belwar then procured an even greater gift for Drizzt, Deep gnomes had traveled to the surface on occasion, and King Schnicktig possessed several copies of rough maps leading out of the Underdark tunnels.
The journey will take you many 10 days, Belwar said to Drizzt when he handed him the rolled parchment. But I fear that never would you find your way at all without this.
Drizzt's hands trembled as he unrolled the map. It was true, he now dared to believe. He was indeed going to the surface. He wanted to tell Belwar at that moment to come along. How could he say goodbye to so dear a friend? But principles had carried Drizzt this far in his travels, and principles demanded that he not be selfish now. He walked out of Blingdenstone the next day, promising Belwar that if he ever came this way again, he would return to visit. Both of them knew he would never return. Miles and days passed uneventfully. Sometimes Drizzt held the magical brooch Belwar had given to him high. Sometimes he walked in the quiet darkness. Whether coincidence or kind fate, he met no monsters along the course laid out on the rough map. Few things had changed in the Underdark, and though the parchment was old, even ancient, the trail was easily followed. Shortly after breaking camp on his 33rd day out of Blingdenstone, Drizzt felt a lightening of the air, a sensation of that cold and vast wind he so vividly remembered. He pulled the onyx figurine from his pouch and summoned Guenhwyvar to his side. Together they walked on, anxiously, expecting the ceiling to disappear around every bend. They came into a small cave, and the darkness beyond the distant archway was not nearly as gloomy as the darkness behind them. Drizzt held his breath and led Guenhwyvar out. Stars twinkled through the broken clouds of the night sky. The moon's silvery light played out in a duller glow behind one large cloud, and the wind howled a mountain song. Drizzt was high up in the realms, perched on the side of a tall mountain in the midst of a mighty range. He minded not at all the bite of the breeze, but stood very still for a long time and watched the meandering clouds passing on their slow aerial trek to the moon. Guenhwyvar stood beside him, unjudging, and Drizzt knew the panther always would.
This book is over, but the story continues. Keep listening after the credits to hear the beginning of Sojourn.
Here's the next title in the series.
Oh, it was coated. At least around a ring around the top. What to put on? I want to start the book tomorrow, fresh tomorrow, instead of starting part of it today. So I want to put something on until then. Let's go with, at least finish off the night with the Grimm fairy tales. Maybe not. Let's pick something a little bit better.
This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, Chapter 1. The time traveler, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite
Recording by Kathy Barrett. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early in February, one wintry day, through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down, walking from Bramblehurst railway station and carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and added a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coach and horses, more dead than alive, and flung his portmanteau down. "A fire!" he cried. "In the name of human charity, a room and a fire!" He stamped and shook the snow from off himself in the bar, and followed Mrs. Hall into her guest parlour to strike his bargain. And with that much introduction, that and a couple of sovereigns flung upon the table, he took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there while she went to prepare him a meal with her own hands. A guest to stop at Iping in the winter-time was an unheard-of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no handler, and she was resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well under way, and Milly, her lymphatic maid, had been brisked up a bit by a few deftly chosen expressions of contempt, she carried the cloth, plates, and glasses into the parlour and began to lay them with the utmost éclat. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat, standing with his back to her and staring out of the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were clasped behind him, and he seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melting snow that still sprinkled his shoulders dripped upon her carpet. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said. "Give them a good dry in the kitchen." "No," he said without turning. She was not sure she had heard him, and was about to repeat her question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on," he said with emphasis, and she noticed that he wore big blue spectacles with sidelights, and had a bush side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his cheeks and face. "Very well, sir," she said. "As you like. In a bit the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and had turned his face away from her again, and Mrs. Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there, like a man of stone, his back hunched, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and ears completely. She put down the eggs and bacon with considerable emphasis and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time, and did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung round and approached the table with a certain eager quickness. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeated at regular intervals. Chirp, chirp, chirp it went, the sound of a spoon being rapidly whisked round a basin. "That girl," she said. "There, clean forgot it. It's her being so long." And while she herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Milly a few verbal stabs for her excessive slowness. She had cooked the ham and eggs, laid the table, and done everything, while Milly, help indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard, and him a new guest and wanted to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot, and putting it with a certain stateliness upon a gold and black tea tray, carried it into the parlor. She rapped and entered promptly. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking something from the floor. She rapped down the mustard pot on the table, and then she noticed the overcoat and hat had been taken off and put over a chair in front of the fire, and a pair of wet boots threatened rust to her steel fender. She went to these things resolutely. "I suppose I may have them to dry now," she said in a voice that brooked no denial. "Leave the hat," said her visitor in a muffled voice, and turning, she saw he had raised his head and was sitting and looking at her. For a moment she stood gaping at him, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth, it was a serviette he had brought with him, over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden, and that was the reason of his muffled voice. But it was not that which startled Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead above his blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and that another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed, excepting only his pink, peaked nose. It was bright, pink, and shiny, just as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high, black, linen-lined collar turned up about his neck. The thick black hair, escaping as it could below and between the crossed bandages, projected in curious tails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. This muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated that for a moment she was rigid. He did not remove the serviette, but remained holding it, as she saw now, with a brown gloved hand, and regarding her with his inscrutable blue glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, speaking very distinctly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock they had received, and she placed the hat on the chair again by the fire. "I didn't know, sir," she began, "that—" and she stopped, embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, glancing from her to the door and then at her again. "I'll have them nicely dried, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at his white swathed head and blue goggles again as she was going out of the door, but his napkin was still in front of his face. She shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was eloquent of her surprise and perplexity. "Never," she whispered. "There." She went quite softly to the kitchen, and was too preoccupied to ask Milly what she was messing about with now when she got there. The visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet. He glanced inquiringly at the window before he removed his serviette and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, took another mouthful, then rose and, taking the serviette in his hand, walked across the room and pulled the blind down to the top of the white muslin that obscured the lower panes. This left the room in a twilight. This done, he returned with an easier air to the table and his meal. "Poor soul's had an accident or an operation or something," said Mrs. Hall. "What a turn them bandages did give me, to be sure." She put on some more coal, unfolded the clothes horse, and extended the traveller's coat upon this. "Neat coats! Why, it looked more like a diving helmet than a human man." She hung his muffler on a corner of the horse, and holding that handkerchief over his mouth all the time, talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too, maybe. She turned round, as one who suddenly remembers. "It's my soul alive," she said, going off at a tangent. "Ain't you done them taters yet, Milly?" When Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or disfigured in the accident she supposed him to have suffered was confirmed, for he was smoking a pipe, and all the time that she was in the room, he never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped around the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece to his lips. Yet it was not forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it as it smouldered out. He sat in the corner with his back to the window blind and spoke now, having eaten and drunk and being comfortably warmed through, with less aggressive brevity than before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles that had lacked hitherto. "I've some luggage," he said, "at Bramblehurst station," and he asked her how he could have it sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgment of her explanation. "Tomorrow," he said. "There is no speedier delivery." He seemed quite disappointed when she answered no. Was she quite sure? No man with a trap who would go over? Mrs. Hall, nothing loath, answered his questions and developed a conversation. "It's a steep road on the down, sir," she said in answer to the question about a trap, and then, snatching at an opening, said, "It was there a carriage was upset a year ago and more. A gentleman killed besides his coachman. Accidents, sir, happen in a moment, don't they?" But the visitor was not to be drawn so easily. "They do," he said through his muffler, eyeing her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. "But they take long enough to get well, don't they? There was my sister's son, Tom, just cut his arm with a scythe, tumbled on it in the hayfield, and bless me, he was 3 months tied up, sir. You'd hardly believe it. It's regular giving me a dread of a scythe, sir." "I can quite understand that," said the visitor. "He was afraid one time that he'd have to have an operation. It was that bad, sir." The visitor laughed abruptly, a bark of a laugh that he seemed to bite and kill in his mouth. "Was he?" he said. "He was, sir, and no laughing matter to them as had the doing for him as I had. My sister being took up with the little one so much. There was bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo. So that if I may make so bold as to say it, sir, will you get me some matches?" said the visitor quite abruptly. "My pipe's out." Mrs. Hall was pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him, after telling him all she had done. She gasped at him for a moment, and remembered the 2 sovereigns. She went for the matches. "Thanks," he said concisely, as she put them down, and turned his shoulder upon her and stared out of the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently he was sensitive on the topic of operations and bandages. She did not make so bold as to say, however, after all. But his snubbing way had irritated her, and Milly had a hot time of it that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlour until 4 o'clock, without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. For the most part he was quite still during that time. It would seem he sat in the growing darkness, smoking
Guys,
in the
we gotta get
firelight,
past this
perhaps
part and
dozing.
we'll
Once or
start
twice a
round
curious
2.
listener might have heard him at the calls, and for the space of 5 minutes he was audible pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Henfrey's First Impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mrs. Hall," said he, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him. "Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," said she, "I'd be glad if you'd give the old clock in the parlour a bit of a look at 6. And leading the way, she went across to the parlour door and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty vestiges of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and his huge yawn below it. Then he stirred, started up in his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held up to his face, just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadow, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir? This man's a coming to look at the clock, sir," she said, recovering from the momentary shock. Look at the clock, he said, staring round in a drowsy manner, and speaking over his hand, and then getting more fully awake.
Okay,
Certainly.
got past that little part.
Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, taken aback. Good afternoon, said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Henfrey says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles. Like a Lockstead. I hope, said Mr. Henfrey, that it's no intrusion. None whatever, said the stranger. Though I understand, he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, that this room is really to be mine for my own private use. I thought, sir, said Mrs. Hall, you prefer the clock. Certainly, said the stranger, certainly, but as a rule I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to, he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Henfrey's manner. Very glad. Mr. Henfrey had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back. And presently, he said, when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea, but not till the clock mending is over. Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henfrey, when her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. You are certain that is the earliest, he said. She was certain, with a marked coldness. I should explain, he added, what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I'm an experimental investigator. Indeed, sir, said Mrs. Hall, much impressed. And my baggage contains apparatus and appliances. Very useful things indeed they are, sir, said Mrs. Hall, and I'm very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries. Of course, sir. My reason for coming to Iping, he proceeded with a certain deliberation of manner, was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident. I thought as much, said Mrs. Hall to herself. Necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together, lock myself up. Sometimes, now and then, not at present, certainly. At such times the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well this thing should be understood. Certainly, sir, said Mrs. Hall, and if I might make so bold as to ask, that, I think, is all, said the stranger, with that quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring, so Mr. Henfrey puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Henfrey not only took off the hands of the clock and the face, but extracted the works, and he tried to work in as slow and quiet and unassuming a manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame and wheels, and left the rest of the room shadowy. When he looked up, colored patches swam in his eyes. Being constitutionally of a curious nature, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure, perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still. So still it got on Henfrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, grey and dim, was the bandaged head and huge blue lenses staring fixedly, with a mist of green spots drifting in front of them. It was so uncanny to Henfrey that for a minute they remained staring blankly at one another. Then Henfrey looked down again. Very uncomfortable position. One would like to say something, should he remark that the weather was very cold for the time of year. He looked up as if to take aim with that introductory shot. The weather? He began. Why don't you finish and go? Said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed rage. All you've got to do is fix the hour hand on its axle. You're simply humbugging. Certainly, sir. 1 minute more. I overlooked. Mr. Henfrey finished and went, but he went feeling excessively annoyed. Damn it, said Mr. Henfrey to himself, trudging down the village through the thawing snow. A man must do a clock at times, surely. And again, get them
man look at you? Ugly. Yet again, seemingly not. If the police was wanting you, it could be more wrapped and bandaged.
At Gleason's corner he saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess at the Coach and Horses, and who now drove the Iping conveyance, when occasional people required it, to Sidderbridge Junction, coming towards him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Sidderbridge, to judge by his driving.
How do, Teddy?
He said, passing.
You got a rummin' up home,
Said Teddy. Hall very sociably pulled up.
What's that?
He asked.
Rum little customer stopping at the Coach and Horses,
Said Teddy,
My sakes.
and he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of his grotesque guest.
Looks a bit like a disguise, don't he? I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping in my place,
said Henfrey.
But women are that trustful, the strangers are concerned. He's took your rooms and you ain't even given a name or.
You don't say so, said Hall, who was a man of sluggish apprehension.
Yes,
Said Teddy.
by the week. Whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. He's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow, so he says. Let's hope it won't be stones in boxes all.
He told Hall how his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with empty portmanteaux. Altogether, he left Hall vaguely suspicious.
Get up, old girl.
Said Hall.
I suppose I must see about this.
Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he had spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall, in spite of these discouragements.
You women don't know everything.
Said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlor and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there, and scrutinized closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computations the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came next day.
Mind your own business, all,
said Mrs. Hall, and I'll mind mine. She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him in her own mind. In the middle of the night, she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her at the end of interminable necks, and with vast black eyes. But being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. End of chapters 1 and 2. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 3. The 1001 Bottles. So it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity and into Iping village. Next day his luggage arrived through the slush, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as a rational man might need, but in addition there were a box of books, big fat books, of which some were just in an incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Hall, tugging with the casual curiosity of the straw, glass bottles. The stranger, muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Fearenside's cart, while Hall was having a word or so of gossip preparatory to helping bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Fearenside's dog, who was sniffing in a dilettante spirit at Hall's legs. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." And he came down the steps towards the tail of the cart, as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Fearenside's dog caught sight of him, however, than it began to bristle and growl savagely, and when he rushed down the steps, it gave an undecided hop, and then sprang straight at his hand. "Whoa!" cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero with dogs, and Fearenside howled, "Lie down," and snatched his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped the hand, heard a kick, saw the dog execute a flanking jump and get home on the stranger's leg, and heard the rip of his trousering. Then the finer end of Fearenside's whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon. It was all the business of a swift half-minute. No one spoke. Everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly at his torn glove and at his leg, made as if he would stoop to the latter, then turned and rushed swiftly up the steps into the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up the uncarpeted stairs to his bedroom. "You brute, you," said Fearenside, climbing off the wagon with his whip in his hand, while the dog watched him through the wheel. "Come here," said Fearenside. "You better." Hall had stood gaping. "It was big," said Hall. "I better go and see to him," and he trotted after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the passage. "Carrier's dog," he said. "Bitten." He went straight upstairs, and the stranger's door being ajar, he pushed it open and was entering without any ceremony, being of a naturally sympathetic turn of mind. The blind was down and the room dim. He caught a glimpse of a most singular thing, what seemed a handless arm waving towards him, and a face of 3 huge indeterminate spots on white, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was struck violently in the chest, hurled back, and the door slammed in his face and locked. It was so rapid that it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indecipherable shapes, a blow and a concussion. There he stood on the dark little landing, wondering what it might be that he had seen. A couple of minutes after, he rejoined the little group that had formed outside the coach and horses. There was Fearenside telling about it all over again for the second time. There was Mrs. Hall saying his dog didn't have no business to bite her guests. There was Huckster, the general dealer from over the road, interrogative, and Sandy Rogers from the forge, judicial, besides women and children, all of them saying fatuities. "Wouldn't it bite me, I knows. Doesn't Ray have such dargs? What are you biting for, then?" And so forth. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he had seen anything so very remarkable happen upstairs. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions. "You don't want no help," he says. "Harry, we better be a-taking of his luggage in." "You ought to have it cauterized at once," said Mr. Huckster, "especially if it's at all inflamed." "I'd shoot, and that's what I'd do," said a lady in the group. Suddenly the dog began growling again. "Come along," cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood the muffled stranger with his collar turned up and his hat brim bent down. "The sooner you get those things in, the better I'll be pleased." It is stated by an anonymous bystander that his trousers and gloves had been changed. "Was you hurt, sir?" said Fearenside. "I'm rare sorry the dog—" "Not a bit," said the stranger. "Never broke the skin. Hurry up with those things." He then swore to himself, so Mr. Hall asserts. Directly the first crate was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlour, the stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard of Mrs. Hall's carpet. And from it he began to produce bottles, little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing coloured and white fluids, fluted blue bottles labelled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bungs, bottles with wooden caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table under the window, round the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist's shop in Bramblehurst could not boast half so many. Quite a sight it was. Crate after crate yielded bottles, until all 6 were empty and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates besides the bottles were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the trunks and other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner in to him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of the bottles into test tubes, that he did not hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray on the table, with some little emphasis perhaps, seeing the state that the floor was in. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again. When she saw he had removed his glasses, they were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again and then turned and faced her. She was about to complain of the straw on the floor when he anticipated her. "I wish you wouldn't come in without knocking," he said in the tone of abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him. "I knocked, but seemingly." "Perhaps you did. But in my investigations, my really very urgent and necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you." "Certainly, sir. You can turn the lock if you like that, you know, any time." "Very good idea," said the stranger. "This straw, sir, if I may make so bold as to remark." "Don't. If the straw makes trouble, put it down in the bill." And he mumbled at her, words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd standing there, so aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman. "In which case, I should like to know, sir, what you consider—" "A shilling. Put down a shilling. Surely a shilling's enough." "So be it," said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. "If you're satisfied, of course." He turned and sat down with his coat collar toward her. All the afternoon he worked with the door lock, and as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part in silence. But once there was a concussion and a sound of bottles ringing together, as though the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not caring to knock. "I can't go on," he was raving. "I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000, the huge multitude. Cheated. All my life it may take me. Patience, patience indeed. Fool, fool." There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks in the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest of his soliloquy. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the faint crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it. "Put it down in the bill," snapped her visitor. "For God's sake, don't worry me. If there's damage done, put it down in the bill." And he went on ticking a list in the exercise book before him. "I'll tell you something," said Fearenside mysteriously. It was late in the afternoon, and they were in a little beer shop of Iping Hanger. "Well," said Teddy Henfrey, "this chap you're speaking of, what my dog bit, well, he's black. Leastways, his legs are. I see through the tear of his trousers and the tear of his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pinky to show, wouldn't you? Well, there wasn't none. Just blackness. I tell you, he's as black as my hat." "My sakes," said Henfrey, "it's a rummy case altogether. Why, his nose is as pink as paint." "That's true," said Fearenside. "I knows that, and I tell you what I'm thinking. That man's a piebald, Teddy. Black here and white there in patches, and he's ashamed of it. He's a kind of half-breed, and the colours come off patchy instead of mixing. I've heard of such things before, and it's the common way with horses, as anyone can see." Chapter 4. Mr. Cuss interviews the stranger. I have told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Iping with a certain fullness of detail, in order that the curious impression he created may be understood by the reader. But excepting 2 odd incidents, the circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may be passed over very cursorily. There were a number of skirmishes with Mrs. Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until late April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedient of an extra payment. Hall did not like him, and whenever he dared, he talked of the advisability of getting rid of him. But he showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it ostentatiously, and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. "Wait till the summer," said Mrs. Hall sagely, "when the artists are beginning to come. Then we'll see. You may be a bit overbearing, but bills settled punctual is bills settled punctual, whatever you'd like to say." The stranger did not go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irreligious days, even in costume. He worked, as Mrs. Hall thought, very fitfully, Some days he would come down early and be continuously busy. On others he would rise late, pace his room, fretting audibly for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part, his manner was that of a man suffering under almost unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him, but though Mrs. Hall listened conscientiously, she could make neither head nor tail of what she heard. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out muffled up invisibly, whether the weather were cold or not, and he chose the loneliest paths and those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat came with a disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two home-going labourers, and Teddy Henfrey, tumbling out of the Scarlet Coat one night at 9:30, was scared shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head, and his walking hat in hand, lit by the sudden light of the opened inn door. Such children as saw him at nightfall dreamt of bogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse, but there was certainly a vivid enough dislike on either side. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable an appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in such a village as Iping. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she would say with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew such things as that, and would thus explain that he discovered things. Her visitor had had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing, there was a view largely entertained that he was a criminal trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up so as to conceal himself altogether from the eye of the police. This idea sprang from the brain of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. No crime of any magnitude dating from the middle or end of February was known to have occurred. Elaborated in the imagination of Mr. Gould, the probationary assistant in the National School, this theory took the form that the stranger was an anarchist in disguise, preparing explosives, and he resolved to undertake such detective operations as his time permitted. These consisted for the most part in looking very hard at the stranger whenever they met, or in asking people who had never seen the stranger leading questions about him, but he detected nothing. Another school of opinion followed Mr. Fearenside, and either accepted the piebald view or some modification of it, as for instance Silas Durgan, who was heard to assert that if he chooses to show himself at fairs, he'd make his fortune in no time, and being a bit of a theologian, compared the stranger to the man with the one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as a harmless lunatic. That had the advantage of accounting for everything straight away. Between these main groups there were waverers and compromisers. Sussex folk have few superstitions, and it was only after the events of early April that the thought of the supernatural was first whispered in the village. Even then it was only credited among the women folk. But whatever they thought of him, people in Iping on the whole agreed in disliking him. His irritability, though it might have been comprehensible to an urban brain worker, was an amazing thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them round quiet corners, the inhuman bludgeoning of all tentative advances of curiosity, the taste for twilight that led to the closing of doors, the pulling down of blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps. Who could agree with such goings-on? They drew aside as he passed down the village, and when he had gone by, young humorists would up with coat collars and down with hat brims, and go pacing nervously after him in imitation of his occult bearing. There was a song popular at that time called "The Bogeyman." Miss Statchell sang it at the schoolroom concert in aid of the church lamps, and thereafter, whenever one or two of the villagers were gathered together and the stranger appeared, a bar or so of this tune, more or less sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also, belated little children would call "Bogeyman" after him, and make off tremulously elated. Cuss, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity. The bandages excited his professional interest. The report of 1,001 bottles aroused his jealous regard. All through April and May, he coveted an opportunity of talking to the stranger, and at last, to the Tintide, he could stand it no longer, but hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know his guest's name. "He give a name," said Mrs. Hall, an assertion which was quite unfounded, "but I didn't rightly hear it." She thought it seemed so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible imprecation from within. "Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and then the door closed and cut Mrs. Hall off from the rest of the conversation. She could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes, then a cry of surprise, a stirring of feet, a chair flung aside, a bark of laughter, quick steps to the door, and Cuss appeared, his face white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left the door open behind him, and without looking at her, strode across the hall and went down the steps, and she heard his feet hurrying along the road. He carried his hat in his hand. She stood behind the door, looking at the open door of the parlor. Then she heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She could not see his face where she stood. The parlor door slammed, and the place was silent again. Cuss went straight up the village to Bunting the vicar. "Am I mad?" Cuss began abruptly, as he entered the shabby little study. "Do I look like an insane person?" "What's happened?" said the vicar, putting the ammonite on the loose sheets of his forthcoming sermon. "That chap at the inn." "Well, give me something to drink," said Cuss, and he sat down. When his nerves had been steadied by a glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available, he told him of the interview he had just had. "Went in," he gasped, "and began to demand a subscription for that nurse fund. He'd stuck his hands in his pockets as I came in, and he sat down lumpily in his chair. Sniffed. I told him I'd heard he took an interest in scientific things. He said yes. Sniffed again. Kept on sniffing all the time. Evidently recently caught an infernal cold. No wonder wrapped up like that. I developed the nurse idea, and all the while kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals, everywhere. Balance, test tubes and stands, and a smell of primrose. Would he subscribe? Said he'd consider it. Asked him point blank, was he researching? Said he was. A long research. Got quite cross. Damnable long research, said he, blowing the cork out, so to speak. Oh, said I, and out came the grievance. The man was just on the boil, and my question boiled him over. He'd been given a prescription, most valuable prescription. What for, he wouldn't say. Was it medical? Damn you, what are you fishing after? I apologised. Dignified sniff and cough. He resumed. He'd read it. 5 ingredients. Put it down, turned his head. Draught of air from window, lifted the paper. Swish, rustle. He was working in a room with an open fireplace, he said. Saw a flicker, and there was the prescription burning and lifting chimneyward. Rushed towards it, just as it whisked up the chimney. So, just at that point, to illustrate his story, out came his arm. Well, no hand, just an empty sleeve. Look, I thought, that's a deformity. Got a cork arm, I suppose, and it's taken it off. Then I thought, there's something odd in that. What the devil keeps that sleeve up and open if there's nothing in it? There was nothing in it, I tell you. Nothing down it, right down to the joint. I could see right down it to the elbow, and there was a glimmer of light shining through a tear of the cloth. Good God, I said. Then he stopped, stared at me with those black goggles of his, and then at his sleeve. Well, that's all. He never said a word, just glared and put his sleeve back in his pocket quickly. I was saying, said he, that there was the prescription burning, wasn't there? Interrogative cough. How the devil, said I, can you move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeve? Yes, said I, an empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, is it? You saw it was an empty sleeve. He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came towards me in 3 very slow steps, stood quite close, sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch, though I'm hanged if that bandaged knob of his and those blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone coming quietly up to you. You said it was an empty sleeve, he said. Certainly, I said. At staring and seeing nothing, a barefaced man,
unspectacled, start to scratch. Then very quietly he pulled his sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm towards me as though he would show it to me again. He did it very, very slowly. I looked at it, seemed an age. Well, said I, clearing my throat, there's nothing in it. Obviously something. I was beginning to feel frightened. I could see right down it. He extended it straight towards me, slowly, slowly, just like that, until the cuff was 6 inches from my face. Queer thing to see an empty sleeve come at you like that. And then, well, something exactly like a finger and a thumb felt nipped my nose. The Bunting began to laugh. There wasn't anything there, said Cuss, his voice running up into a shriek at the there. It's all very well for you to laugh, but I tell you I was so startled I hit his cuff hard and turned round and cut out of the room. I left him. Cuss stopped. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his panic. He turned round in a helpless way and took a second glass of the excellent Vicar's very inferior sherry. When I hit his cuff, said Cuss, I tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm. And there wasn't an arm. There wasn't the ghost of an arm. Bunting thought it over. He looked suspiciously at Cuss. It's a most remarkable story, he said. He looked very wise and grave indeed. It's really, said Mr. Bunting with judicial emphasis, a most remarkable story. End of chapters 3 and 4. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 5. The Burglary at the Vicarage. The facts of the burglary at the vicarage came to us chiefly through the medium of the vicar and his wife. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in Iping to the club festivities. Mrs. Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly in the stillness that comes before the dawn, with the strong impression that the door of their bedroom had opened and closed. She did not arouse her husband at first, but sat up in bed listening. She then distinctly heard the pad, pad, pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing room and walking along the passage towards the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she aroused the Reverend Mr. Bunting as quietly as possible. He did not strike a light, but putting on his spectacles, her dressing gown, and his bath slippers, he went out on the landing to listen. He heard quite distinctly fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that, he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon, the poker, and descended the staircase as noiselessly as possible. Mrs. Bunting came out on the landing. The hour was about 4, and the ultimate darkness of the night was past. There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still except the faint creaking of the stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread and the slight movements in the study. Then something snapped, the drawer was opened, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came an imprecation, and a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door he could see the desk and the open drawer, and a candle burning on the desk. But the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall, undecided what to do, and Mrs. Bunting, her face white and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing kept Mr. Bunting's courage, the persuasion that this burglar was a resident in the village. They heard the chink of money, and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold, £2 10½ sovereigns altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to abrupt action. Gripping the poker firmly, he rushed into the room, closely followed by Mrs. Bunting. "Surrender!" cried Mr. Bunting fiercely, and then stopped amazed. Apparently the room was perfectly empty. Yet their conviction that they had that very moment heard somebody moving in the room had amounted to a certainty. For half a minute, perhaps, they stood gaping. Then Mrs. Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by a kindred impulse, peered under the desk. Then Mrs. Bunting turned back the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with the poker. Then Mrs. Bunting scrutinized the waste paper basket, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of the coal scuttle. Then they came to a stop and stood, with eyes interrogating each other. "Could have sworn," said Mr. Bunting. The candle, said Mr. Bunting. Who lit a candle? The drawer, said Mrs. Bunting, and the money's gone. She went hastily to the doorway. What the strange occurrences? There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did so, the kitchen door slammed. Bring the candle, said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he suddenly discovered that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. He is certain that nothing went out of the door. It opened, stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. As it did so, the candle Mrs. Bunting was carrying from the study flickered and flared. It was a minute or more before they entered the kitchen. The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen, pantry, and scullery thoroughly, and at last went down into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house, search as they would. Daylight found the vicar and his wife, a quaintly costumed little couple, still marveling about on their own ground floor by the unnecessary light of a guttering candle. Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. Now it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Milly was hunted out for the day, Mr. Hall and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature, and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall found she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert and principal operator in this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. On the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went on into his own room and found the bottle as he had been directed. But returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch. And with a flash of inspiration, he connected this with the stranger's room upstairs and the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Mrs. Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight, he stopped, gaping, then with the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room also, was empty, and what was stranger, even to his heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed were scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat even was cocked jauntily over the bedpost. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming out of the depth of the cellar, with that rapid telescoping of the syllables, an interrogative cocking up of the final words to a high note, by which the West Sussex villager is wont to indicate a brisk impatience. "George, you got what I want?" At that, he turned and hurried down to her. "Jenny," he said, over the rail of the cellar steps, "does the truth what Henfrey says? He's not in his room, he ain't, and the front door's unbolted." At first, Mrs. Hall did not understand, and as soon as she did, she resolved to see the empty room for herself. Hall, still holding the bottle, went first. "There," he said, "his clothes are. What's he doing without his clothes, then? It's a most curious business." As they came up the cellar steps, they both, it was afterwards ascertained, fancied they heard the front door open and shut, but seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it at the time. Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. Someone sneezed on the staircase. Hall, following 6 steps behind, thought that he heard her sneeze. She, going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood regarding the room. "Curious," she said. She heard a sniff close behind her head as it seemed, and turning, was surprised to see Hall a dozen feet off on the topmost stair. But in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow, and then under the clothes. "Cold," she said. "He's been up this hour or more." As she did so, a most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if a hand had clutched them in the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the stranger's hat popped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air through the better part of a circle, and then down straight
round
at
two's
Mrs. Hall's
already
face.
done.
Then, as swiftly came the sponge from the washstand, and then the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside, and laughing dryly in a voice singularly like the stranger's, turned itself up with its 4 legs at Mrs. Hall, seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back, and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph for a moment, and then abruptly everything was still. Mrs. Hall was left almost in a fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with the greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Milly, who had been roused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting her downstairs, and applying the restoratives customary in such cases. "'Twas spirits," said Mrs. Hall. "I know 'tis spirits. I've read papers of 'em. Tables and chairs leaping and dancing." "Take a drop more, Jenny," said Hall. "'Twas steadier." "Lock him out," said Mrs. Hall. "Don't let him come in again. I half guessed. I might have known. With them goggling eyes and bandaged head, and never going to church of a Sunday. And all these bottles, more than it's right for anyone to have. He's put the spirits into the furniture. Good old furniture. 'Twas in that very chair my poor dear mother used to sit when I was a little girl. I think it should rise up against me now." "Just a jot more, Jenny," said Hall. "Your nerves is all upset." They sent Milly across the street through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wadgers, the blacksmith. Mr. Hall's compliments, and the furniture upstairs was behaving most extraordinary. Would Mr. Wadgers come round? He was a knowing man, was Mr. Wadgers, and very resourceful. He took quite a grave view of the case. "I'm damned if they ain't witchcraft," was the view of Mr. Sandy Wadgers. "One horseshoes for such gentry as they." He came round greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way upstairs to the room, but he didn't seem to be in any hurry. He preferred to talk in the passage. Over the way, Huckster's apprentice came out and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. Mr. Huckster naturally followed over in the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government asserted itself. There was a great deal of talk and no decisive action. "Let's have the facts first," insisted Mr. Sandy Wadgers. "Let's be sure we be acting perfectly right in busting that there door open. A door unbust is always open to busting, but you can't unbust a door once you've busted it." And suddenly and most wonderfully, the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord, and as they looked up in amazement, they saw descending the stairs the muffled figure of the stranger, staring more blackly and blankly than ever with those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring all the time. He walked across the passage, staring, then stopped. "Look there," he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor, and suddenly, swiftly, viciously, slammed the door in their faces. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away. They stared at one another. "If that don't lick everything," said Mr. Wadgers, and left the alternative unsaid. "I'll go in and ask him about it," said Wadgers to Mr. Hall. "I demand an explanation." It took some time to bring the landlady's husband up to that pitch. At last he rapped, opened the door, and got as far as, "Excuse me." "Go to the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice, "and shut that door after you." So that brief interview terminated. Chapter 7. The Unveiling of the Stranger. The stranger went into the little parlor of the Coach and Horses about 5:30 in the morning, and there he remained until near midday, the blinds down, the door shut, and none, after Hall's repulse, venturing near him. All that time he must have fasted. Thrice he rang his bell, the third time furiously and continuously, but no one answered him. "Him and his go to the devil, indeed," said Mrs. Hall. Presently came in a perfect rumour of the burglary at the vicarage, and two were put together. Hall, assisted by Wadgers, went off to find Mr. Shackelford, the magistrate, and take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself is unknown. Now and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses, a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles.
The little group of scared but curious people increased. Mrs. Webster came over. Some gay young fellows resplendent in black ready-made jackets and piqué paper ties, for it was Whit Monday, joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Harker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. He could see nothing, but gave reason for supposing that he did, and others of the Iping youth presently joined him. It was the finest of all possible Whit Mondays, and down the village street stood a row of nearly a dozen booths, a shooting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons and some picturesque strangers of both sexes putting up a coconut shy. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies white apron and quite fashionable hats with painted plumes. Wadger, of the Purple Fawn, and Mr. Jaggers, the cobbler, who also sold old second-hand ordinary bicycles, were stretching a string of Union Jacks and Royal Ensigns, which had originally celebrated the first Victorian Jubilee, across the road. And inside, in the artificial darkness of the parlour, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry we must suppose, and fearful, hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, poured through his dark glasses upon his paper, or chinked his dirty little bottles, and occasionally swore savagely at the boys, audibly if invisible, outside the windows. In the corner by the fireplace lay the fragments of half a dozen smashed bottles, and a pungent clang of chlorine tainted the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time, and from what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon he suddenly opened his parlour door, and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people at the bar. "Mrs. Hall," he said. Somebody went sheepishly and called for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared after an interval, a little short of breath, but all the fiercer for that. Hall was still out. She had deliberated over this scene, and she came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. "Is it your bill you're wanting, sir?" she said. "Why wasn't my breakfast stayed? Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bell? Do you think I live without eating?" "Why isn't my bill paid?" said Mrs. Hall. "That's what I want to know." "I told you 3 days ago I was awaiting a remittance." "I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to await no remittances. You can't grumble if your breakfast waits a bit, if my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "No," from the bar. "And I thank you kindly, sir, if you keep your swearing to yourself, sir," said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood looking more like an angry diving helmet than ever. It was universally felt in the bar that Mrs. Hall had the better of him. His next words showed as much. "Look here, my good woman," he began. "Don't good woman me," said Mrs. Hall. "I've told you my remittance hasn't come." "Remittance indeed," said Mrs. Hall. "Still, I dare say in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you." "Well, I found some more." "Hello?" from the bar. "I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" he said. "That I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. "And before I take any bills or get any breakfast or do any such things whatsoever, you got to tell me one or 2 things I don't understand, and what nobody don't understand, and what everybody's very anxious to understand. I want to know what you've been doing to my chair upstairs, and I want to know how 'tis your room was empty, and how you got in again. Them as stops in this house comes in by the doors. That's the rule of the house, and that you didn't do. And what I want to know is how you did come in. And I want to know—" Suddenly the stranger raised his gloved hands, clenched, stamped his foot, and said "Stop!" with such an extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am or what I am. I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose, it was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture, tore at his whiskers and bandages. For a moment they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. "Oh, my God," said someone.
Then off they came. It was worse than anything. Mrs. Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors, but nothing. The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobbledehoy jump to avoid them. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the stairs. For the man who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was a solid, gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him, and then nothingness. No visible thing at all. People down the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street, saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall down, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey jump to avoid tumbling over her, and then they heard the frightful screams of Milly, who, emerging suddenly from the kitchen at the noise of the tumult, had come upon the headless stranger from behind. These increased suddenly. Forthwith, everyone all down the street, the sweetstuff seller, coconut shy proprietor and his assistant, the swingman, little boys and girls, rustic dandies, smart wenches, smocked elders, and aproned gypsies, began running towards the inn, and in a miraculously short space of time, a crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted, and inquired and exclaimed and suggested in front of Mrs. Hall's establishment. Everyone seemed eager to talk at once, and the result was Babel. A small group supported Mrs. Hall, who was picked up in a state of collapse. There was a conference, and the incredible evidence of a vociferous eyewitness. Oh,
Some wedding cake.
What's he been doing
At
then?
least for now.
At the door, has he? For nothing with a knife, I believe.
Here in a little bit,
No
we'll do
head, I
some
tell you. I don't mean no
key
manner
lime
of
pie.
speaking. I mean man without a head. Nonsense, it's some conjuring trick. Fetched off his weapon, he did. In its struggles to see in through the open door, the crowd formed itself into a straggling wedge, with the more adventurous apex nearest the inn. He stood for a moment. I heard the gal scream and he turned. I saw his skirts whisk and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds. Back he comes with a knife in his hand and a loaf. Stood just as if he was staring. Not a moment ago, when he that there door. Tell you, you ain't got no head at all. You just missed him. There was a disturbance behind, and the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First, Mr. Hall, very red and determined, then Mr. Bobby Jaffers, the village constable, and then the wary Mr. Rogers. They had come now armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. "I don't know, Ed," said Jaffers. "I got to restin',
Key
and
lime
restin'
pie.
I will." Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight to the door of the parlour, and flung it open. "Constable," he said, "do your duty." Jaffers marched in, Hall next, Rogers last. They saw in the dim light the headless figure facing them, with a large crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. "That's him," said Hall. "What the devil is this?" came in a tone of angry expostulation from above the collar of the figure. "You're a damn rum customer, mister," said Mr. Jaffers. "But I don't know the warrant says bunny, and duty's duty." "Keep off," said the figure, starting back. Abruptly he whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped the knife on the table in time to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove and was slapped in Jaffers' face. In another moment, Jaffers, cutting short some statement concerning a warrant, had gripped him by the handless wrist and caught his invisible throat. He got a sounding kick on the shin that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Hall sent the knife sliding along the table to Wadgers, who acted as goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers and the stranger swayed towards him, clutching and hitting in. A chair stood in the way and went aside with a crash as they came down together. "Get the feet," said Jaffers between his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavoring to act on instructions, received a sounding kick in the ribs that disposed of him for a moment, and Mr. Wadgers, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, knife in hand, and so
Northern
collided with
Lights on
Mr.
this
Huckster
one.
and the Sidderbridge carter
I'm
coming to the
not,
rescue
I'm not
of
too
law and
happy
order.
with this battery.
At the same moment, down came 3 or
I
4
gotta
bottles
get
from
another
the
one just
chiffonier
because
and shot a web of pungent
this one
into
doesn't
the air
hit.
of the room. "I'll surrender," cried the stranger,
I'm not happy
though he
with the way
had
it
Jaffers
hits.
down, and in another moment he stood up panting.
A strange figure, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove now as well as his left. "It's no good," he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world to hear that voice coming as if out of empty space, but the Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also and produced a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. "I say," said Jaffers, brought up short by a dim realization of the incongruity of the whole business. "Darn it, can't use him as I can see." The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by a miracle the buttons to which his empty sleeve pointed became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. "What?" said Huckster suddenly. "That's not a man at all. It's just empty clothes. Look, you can see down his collar and the linings of his clothes. I can put you on your arm." He extended his hand. It seemed to meet something in the air, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation. "Wish you'd keep your things out of my eye," said the old voice in a tone of savage expostulation. "Fact is, I'm all here. Head, hands, legs, and all the rest of it. It happens I'm invisible. Confounded nuisance, but I am. That's no reason why I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin in Ugby, is it?" The suit of clothes, now all unbuttoned and hanging loosely upon its unseen supports, stood up, arms akimbo. Several other of the men folks had now entered the room, so that it was closely crowded. "Visible, eh?" said Huckster, ignoring the stranger's abuse. "Who ever heard the likes of
I
that?
see that now.
It's strange, perhaps, but it's crime. Why am I not a policeman in this fashion?" "Oh, that's a different matter," said Jack. "No doubt you're a bit difficult to see in this light, but I've got a warrant and it's all correct. What I'm after ain't no invisibility. It's burglary.
I said about
There's
you
a
happy
house been
with it,
broken
and it
into
gives
in
me a hit
months
like that. I guess I changed my
Well,
mind.
circumstances certainly point. Nonsense, said the invisible man. "I hope so, sir. I've got my instructions. I'll come, but no handcuffs." "It's the regular thing," said Jaffers. "No handcuffs," stipulated the stranger. "Pardon
It
me,"
is freshly
said
charged,
Jaffers.
though.
Abruptly, the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize what was being done, his sweater, socks, and trousers had been kicked off. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat. "Here, stop that," said Jaffers, suddenly realizing what was happening. He gripped at the waistcoat. It struggled, and the shirt slipped
I
out of
give
it
it a
and left
little
it
bit
limp
after
and
that
empty in his hand. "Hold him," said Jaffers loudly. "Once he gets the things off." cried everyone. And they were left with the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face. It stopped his open-armed advance and sent him backward into old Toothsome the sexton, and in another moment the garment was lifted up and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms, even as the shirt was being thrust over a man's head. Jaffers clutched at it and only helped to pull it off. He was struck in the mouth out of the air and incontinently threw his truncheon and smote Teddy Henfrey savagely upon the crown of his head. "Look out!" said everybody, fetching and grinding and hitting at nothing. "Hold him! Shut the door! Don't get him loose! I've got something! Here he is!" A perfect babel of noises they made. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Wadgers, knowing as ever, and his wit sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and led them out. The others, following incontinently, were jammed for a moment in the corner by the doorway. The hidden Phipps, the Unitarian, had a front tooth broken, and Henfrey was injured in the cartilage of his ear. Jaffers was struck under the jaw, and turning, called at something that intervened between him and Huckster in the melee, and prevented their coming together. He felt a muscular chest, and in another moment the whole mass of struggling, excited men shot out into the crowded hall. "I got him!" shouted Jaffers, choking and reeling through them all, and wrestling with purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered right and left as the extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly towards the house door and went spinning down the half-dozen steps of the inn. Jaffers cried in a strangling voice, holding tight nevertheless and making play with his knee, spun around and fell heavily undermost with his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were excited cries of "Hold him!
Invisible! And so forth, and a young stranger in the place, whose name did not come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, and fell over the constable's prostrate body. Halfway across the road, a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog, kicked apparently, yelped and ran howling into Huckster's yard, and with that, the transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space, people stood amazed and gesticulating, and then came panic and scattered them abroad through the village as the dust scatters dead leaves. But Jaffers lay quite still, face upward and knees bent, at the foot of the steps of the inn. End of chapters 5, 6, and 7. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 8. In Transit. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief, and relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while lying out on the spacious open downs without a soul within a couple of miles of him, as he thought, and almost dozing, heard close to him the sound as of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself, and looking, beheld nothing. Yet the voice was indisputable. It continued to swear with that breadth and variety that distinguishes the swearing of a cultivated man. It grew to a climax, diminished again, and died away in the distance, going, as it seemed to him, in the direction of Aberdeen. It limited to a spasmodic sneeze and ended. Gibbons had heard nothing of the morning's occurrences, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing that his philosophical tranquillity vanished. He got up hastily and hurried down the steepness of the hill towards the village as fast as he could go. Chapter 9. Mr. Thomas Marvel. You must picture Mr. Thomas Marvel as a person of copious, flexible visage, a nose of cylindrical protrusion, a liquorish, ample, fluctuating mouth, and a beard of bristling eccentricity. His figure inclined to embonpoint. His short limbs accentuated this inclination. He wore a furry silk hat, and the frequent substitution of twine and shoelaces for buttons, apparent at critical points of his costume, marked a man essentially bachelor. Mr. Thomas Marvel was sitting with his feet in a ditch by the roadside over the down towards Aberdeen, about a mile and a half out of Iping. His feet, save for socks of irregular openwork, were bare, his big toes were broad, and pricked like the ears of a watchful dog. In a leisurely manner, he did everything in a leisurely manner, he was contemplating trying on a pair of boots. They were the soundest boots he had come across for a long time, but too large for him, whereas the ones he had were, in dry weather, a very comfortable fit, but too thin-soled for damp. Mr. Marvel hated roomy shoes, and he hated damp. He had never properly thought out which he hated most, and it was a pleasant day, and there was nothing better to do. So he put the 4 shoes in a graceful group on the turf and looked at them. And seeing them there among the grass and springing agrimony, it suddenly occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. He was not at all startled by a voice behind him. "They're boots, anyhow," said the voice. "They are.
I feel a
Churchy
little bit
boots,"
better
said
now.
Mr. Thomas Marvel, his head on one side, regarding them distastefully. "Which is the ugliest pair in the old blessed universe? I'm darned if I know." Said the voice. "Well, in fact, I've worn none, but none so audacious ugly, if you'll allow the expression. I've been caging boots in particular for days, because I was sick of them. Sound enough, of course, but a gentleman on tramp sees such a thundering lot of his boots, and if you'll believe me, there is nothing in the old blessed country, try as I would, but them. Look at them, and a good country for boots too, in a general way. It's just my promiscuous luck. I've got boots in this country 10 years and more, and then they treat you like this." "It's a beast of a country," said the voice, "and pigs for people." "Ain't it?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "No, but them boots, it beats it." He turned his head over his shoulder to the right to look at the boots of his interlocutor with a view to comparisons, and lo, where the boots of his interlocutor should have been, were neither legs nor boots. He was irradiated by the dawn of a great amazement. "Where are you?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel over his shoulder, and coming on all fours. He saw a stretch of empty downs, with the wind swaying the remote green-pointed furze bushes. "Am I drunk?" said Mr. Marvel. "Have I had visions? Was I talking to myself? What the—" "Don't be alarmed," said a voice.
Got some boba
"Well,
hash
you're going to
still.
triloquise me," said Mr. Thomas
Not that
Marvel,
much, but
rising
I still
sharply
got a
to his
little bit.
feet. "Where are you?" "Alarmed indeed." "Don't be alarmed," repeated the voice. "You'll be alarmed in a minute, you silly fool," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Where are you? Let me get my mark on you." "Are you married?" Mr. Thomas Marvel, after an interval. There was no answer. Mr. Thomas Marvel stood bootless and amazed, his jacket nearly thrown off. "You," said a peewit very remote. "Peewit indeed," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "This ain't no time for foolery." The down was desolate, east and west, north and south. The road, with its shallow ditches and white bordering stakes, ran smooth and empty north and south. Save for that peewit, the blue sky was empty too. "So help me," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, shuffling his coat onto his shoulders again. "It's the drink. I might have known." "It's not the drink," said the voice. "You keep your nerves steady." "Ow!" said Mr. Marvel, and his face grew white amidst its patches. "Drink," his lips repeated noiselessly. He remained staring about him, rotating slowly backwards. "Could have swore I heard a voice," he whispered. "Of course you did." "It's there again," said Mr. Marvel, closing his eyes and clasping his hand on his brow with a tragic gesture. He was suddenly taken by the collar and shaken violently, and left more dazed than ever. "Don't be a fool," said the voice. "I'm off my blooming job," said Mr. Marvel. "It's no good. It's fretting about them blasted boots. I'm off my blessed blooming job. Or it's spirits." "Neither one nor the other," said the voice. "Listen." "Job," said Mr. Marvel. "1 minute," said the voice, penetratingly, tremulous with self-control. "Well?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with a strange feeling of having been dug in the chest by a finger. "You think I'm just imagination? Just imagination?" "What else can you be?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rubbing the back of his neck. "Very well," said the voice, in a tone of relief. "Then I'm going to throw flints at you till you think differently." "Where are you?" The voice made no answer. Whiz came a flint, apparently out of the air. It missed Mr. Marvel's shoulder by a hair's breadth. Mr. Marvel, turning, saw a flint jerk up into the air, trace a complicated path, hang for a moment, and then fling at his feet with almost invisible rapidity. He was too amazed to dodge. Whiz it came, ricocheted from the bare toe into the ditch. Mr. Thomas Marvel jumped a foot and howled aloud. Then he started to run, tripped over an unseen obstacle, and came head over heels into a sitting position. "Now," said the voice, as a third stone curved upward and hung in the air above the tramp. "Am I imagination?" Mr. Marvel, by way of reply, struggled to his feet and was immediately rolled over again. He lay quiet for a moment. "If you struggle any more," said the voice, "I shall throw the flint at your head." "It's a fair do," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, sitting up, taking his wounded toe in hand and fixing his eye on the third missile. "I don't understand it. Stones flinging themselves. Stones talking. Put yourself down. Right away. I'm done." The third flint fell. "It's very simple," said the voice. "I'm an invisible man." "Tell us something I don't know," said Mr. Marvel, gasping with pain. "Where you vid? How you do it? I don't know. I'm beat." "That's all," said the voice. "I'm invisible. That's what I want you to understand." "Anyone could see that. There's no need for you to be so confounded impatient, mister. Now, give us a notion. How are you in?" "I'm invisible. That's the great point. And what I want you to understand is this." "But whereabouts?" interrupted Mr. Marvel. "Here, 6 yards in front of you." "Oh, come, I ain't blind. You'll be telling me next you're just thin air. I'm not one of your ignorant tramps." "Yes, I am. Thin air. You're looking through me." "What? Ain't there any stuff, do you? Vox it? What is it? Jabber? Is that it?" "I am just a human being, solid, needing food and drink, needing covering too. But I'm invisible. You see? Invisible. Simple idea. Invisible." "What? Real, like?" "Yes, real." "Let's have a hand of you," said Marvel. "If you are real, you won't be so darn out of the way like them." "Lord, he said. "How you made me jump, gripping me like that." He felt the hand that had closed round his wrist with his disengaged fingers, and his fingers went timorously up the arm, patted a muscular chest, and explored a bearded face. Marvel's face was astonishment. "Dashed," he said. "It is no big cockfighting. Most remarkable. Near I can see a rabbit clean through you half a mile away. Not a bit of you visible. Except—" He scrutinized the apparently empty space keenly. "You haven't been eating bread and cheese?" he asked, holding the invisible arm. "You're quite right, and it's not quite assimilated into the system." "Ah," said Mr. Marvel. "Sort of ghostly, though." "Of course, all this isn't half so wonderful as you think." "It's quite wonderful enough for my modest wants," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "How'd you manage it? How the deuce is it done?" "It's too long a story. Besides, I tell you, the old business fairly beats me," said Mr. Marvel. "What I want to say at present is this. I need help. I have come to that. I came upon you suddenly. I was wandering, mad with rage, naked, impotent, would have murdered, and I saw you." "Law," said Mr. Marvel. "I came up behind you, hesitated, went on." Mr. Marvel's expression was eloquent. "You stopped. 'Here,' I said, 'is an outcast like myself. This is the man for me.' So I turned back and came to you. You, and—" "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, "but I'm all in a dizzy. May I ask, how is it, and what you may be requiring in the way of help?" "Invisible." "I want you to help me get clothes and shelter. Then, with other things, I've left them long enough. If you won't, well, but you will, must." "Look here," said Mr. Marvel, "I'm too flabbergasted. Don't rock me about any more, and leave me go. I must get steady a bit. I've pretty near broken my toe. It's all so unreasonable. Empty downs, empty sky, nothing visible for miles except the bosom of nature. And then comes a voice out of heaven. Stones. A fist. Lord." "Pull yourself together," said the voice, "for you have to do the job I've chosen for you." Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were round. "I've chosen you," said the voice. "You are the only man, except some of those fools down there, who knows there is such a thing as an invisible man. You have to be my helper. Help me, and I will do great things for you. An invisible man is a man of power." He stopped for a moment to sneeze violently. "But if you betray me," he said, "if you fail to do as I direct you—" He paused and tapped Mr. Marvel's shoulder smartly. Mr. Marvel gave a yelp of terror at the touch. "Well, I don't want to betray you," said Mr. Marvel, edging away from the direction of the fingers. "Don't you go a thinking that, whatever you do. All I want to do is to help you. Just tell me what I gotta do. Oh, whatever you want done, that I'm most willing to do." Chapter 10. Mr. Marvel's Visit to Iping. After the first gusty panic had spent itself, Iping became argumentative. Skepticism suddenly reared its head. Rather nervous skepticism, not at all assured of its back, but skepticism nevertheless. It is so much easier not to believe in an invisible man. Those who had actually seen him dissolve into thin air, or felt the strength of his arm, could be counted on the fingers of two hands. And of Mr. Wadgers was presently missing, having retired impregnably behind the bolts and bars of his own house, and Jabbers was lying stunned in the parlor of the Coach and Horses. Great and strange ideas transcending experience often have less effect upon men and women than smaller, more tangible considerations. Iping was gay with bunting, and everybody was in gala dress. Whit Monday had been looked forward to for a month or more. By the afternoon, even those who believed in the unseen were beginning to resume their little amusements in a tentative fashion, on the supposition that he had quite gone away, and with the skeptics he was already a jest. But people, skeptics and believers alike, were remarkably sociable all that day. Hazeman's Meadow was gay with a tent in which Mrs. Bunting and other ladies were preparing tea, while without, the Sunday school children ran races and played games under the noisy guidance of the curate and the Misses Cuss and Sackville. No doubt there was a slight uneasiness in the air, but people, for the most part, had the sense to conceal whatever imaginative qualms they experienced. On the village green, an inclined strong rope, down which, clinging the while to a pulley swung handle, one could be hurled violently against a sack at the other end, came in for considerable favor among the adolescents, as also did the swings and the coconut shies. There was also promenading, and the steam organ attached to a small roundabout filled the air with a pungent flavor of oil and with equally pungent music. Members of the club who had attended church in the morning were splendid in badges of pink and green, and some of the gayer-minded had also adorned their bowler hats with brilliant colored favors of ribbon. Old Fletcher, whose conceptions of holiday-making were severe, was visible through the jasmine about his window, or through the open door, whichever way you chose to look, poised delicately on a plank supported on 2 chairs, and whitewashing the ceiling of his front room. About 4 o'clock, a stranger entered the village from the direction of the Downs. He was a short, stout person in an extraordinarily shabby top hat, and he appeared to be very much out of breath. His cheeks were alternately limp and tightly puffed. His mottled face was apprehensive, and he moved with a sort of reluctant alacrity. He turned the corner of the church and directed his way to the Coach and Horses. Among others, old Fletcher remembers seeing him, and indeed the old gentleman was so struck by his peculiar agitation that he inadvertently allowed a quantity of whitewash to run down the brush into the sleeve of his coat while regarding him. This stranger, to the perceptions of the proprietor of the coconut shy, appeared to be talking to himself, and Mr. Huckster remarked the same thing. He stopped at the foot of the Coach and Horses steps, and according to Mr. Huckster, appeared to undergo a severe internal struggle before he could induce himself to enter the house. Finally, he marched up the steps, and was seen by Mr. Huckster to turn to the left and open the door of the parlor. Mr. Huckster heard voices from within the room and from the bar apprising the man of his error. "That room's private," said Hall, and the stranger shut the door clumsily and went into the bar. In the course of a few minutes he reappeared, wiping his lips with the back of his hand with an air of quiet satisfaction that somehow impressed Mr. Huckster as assumed. He stood looking about him for some moments, and then Mr. Huckster saw him walk in an oddly furtive manner towards the gates of the yard, upon which the parlor window opened. The stranger, after some hesitation, leaned against one of the gate posts, produced a short clay pipe, and prepared to fill it. His fingers trembled while doing so. He lit it clumsily, and folding his arms began to smoke in a languid attitude, an attitude which his occasional glances up the yard altogether belied. All this Mr. Huckster saw over the canisters of the tobacco window, and the singularity of the man's behavior prompted him to maintain his observation. Presently the stranger stood up abruptly and put his pipe in his pocket. Then he vanished into the yard. Forthwith, Mr. Huckster, conceiving he was witness of some petty larceny, leapt round his counter and ran out into the road to intercept the thief. As he did so, Mr. Marvel reappeared, his hat askew, a big bundle in a blue tablecloth in one hand, and 3 books tied together, as it proved afterwards with the vicar's braces, in the other. Directly he saw Huckster, he gave a sort of gasp, and turning sharply to the left, began to run. "Stop, thief!" cried Huckster, and set off after him. Mr. Huckster's sensations were vivid but brief. He saw the man just before him, and spurting briskly for the church corner and the hill road. He saw the village flags and festivities beyond, and a face or so turned towards him. He bawled, "Stop!" again. He had hardly gone 10 strides before his shin was caught in some mysterious fashion, and he was no longer running, but flying with inconceivable rapidity through the air. He saw the ground suddenly close to his face. The world seemed to splash into a million whirling specks of light, and subsequent proceedings interested him no more. Chapter 11. In the Coach and Horses. Now, in order clearly to understand what had happened in the inn, it is necessary to go back to the moment when Mr. Marvel first came into view of Mr. Huckster's window. At that precise moment, Mr. Cuss and Mr. Bunting were in the parlor. They were seriously investigating the strange occurrences of the morning, and were, with Mr. Hall's permission, making a thorough examination of the Invisible Man's belongings. Jaffers had partially recovered from his fall, and had gone home in the charge of his sympathetic friends. The stranger's scattered garments had been removed by Mrs. Hall, and the room tidied up.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call Into This Life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keep stopping by. And tomorrow will be a fresh book. We're starting over on little time series, just in case a lot of people missed some of the first ones. So we'll be starting with book 1 tomorrow. But until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.